Where did you grow up, Don, and when did you first know, if you did know, that you eventually wanted to be a journalist?
Well, I grew up in Buffalo, New York, Dennis, and actually from courses I took in high school, mainly history and public address and political science. I was always interested in history, current events, and I was also on the public address system announcing the homeroom notices, and I guess I got kind of interested in broadcasting through that and wanted to always go into radio. So I did go into radio. I was a disc jockey for a while, and then I gravitated into the news end of the business and started in Syracuse, where I went to school, and then came to Washington about 1961 and worked for a small radio station in Silver Spring on the outskirts of Washington, and eventually made my way downtown to a small news organization, a radio outfit called Radio Press International, which was the forerunner in many ways of United Press International audio, and eventually went to work for UPI Audio in about 1962.
Don, I've always thought that there were two kinds of radio journalists. There were the ones who started in newspaper work, and the ones like you and I who started out as disc jockeys. I think it's very common that a lot of us who loved broadcasting got into the business first spinning records.
I think that that's true, and I'm certainly glad that I picked radio journalism, because I think I not only could write pretty well and tell a pretty good story, but that I did have the pipes, as they call one's voice in broadcasting, to make it in radio.
Well, you know, Don, you're slightly older than I am, not much, but you don't sound any different than when I first heard you 30 years ago.
Well, you sound the same too, Dennis.
Well, maybe we can stay that way for a while.
That would be great.
Don, were you a child of radio? I know I just missed it, and what I've been doing in developing a love of those old radio shows is the fact I've done a lot of research and gotten a lot of those shows. But were you just far enough ahead of me that you were still listening to network radio, or was all of that gone when you were growing up?
I was a big radio fan of every radio show that you could think of, from Bob and Ray to the Green Hornet to Superman and all the rest. I was frequently listening to the radio and just loved it, and hung around a lot of radio stations in Buffalo and got to know some of the personalities, and I don't know, somehow just enjoyed the radio life so much that I eventually joined it.
You know, Buffalo, which I always thought was kind of one of the great overlooked urban areas in the country, gave birth to a lot of big people in the media, and I guess best known, which was a couple of decades before you came into broadcasting there, was Bob Smith, Buffalo Bob.
Buffalo Bob, Howdy Doody, was one of my favorite TV shows growing up. And yeah, we did place a lot of emphasis on the fact he was one of ours, and I hardly ever missed that show.
Don, what was it like to move to Washington, D.C.? How old were you when you made that move?
I think I was around, it was right after college. My first job in news was in Syracuse at a station which I think is still there, WHEN. I was the assistant news director, and I always wanted to go to Washington because I loved politics so much, current events, and Washington is the world capital of news. So I eventually started writing letters to stations and networks in Washington, and finally did find my way here.
Well, you know, you had a little bit of an advantage having been from an urban area, more so than a lot of us. I moved from a town of 10,000 to Washington, D.C. Now, I had visited out there very, very, very frequently, but I can imagine, because a lot of young announcers, will go to the ends of the earth to find a job sometimes. Was it a culture shock for you moving down there, or did you immediately feel you fit in?
I actually fit in very well because I had dreamed of being a reporter in Washington for so long. And it was a slight culture shock because Buffalo is a pretty small town compared to Washington, and the legislature and the White House and, all of the Washington landmarks and everything was, just a big thrill for me to enter this world. And and to meet all of the personalities, the politicians and so on that I'd just been reading about. So it was a mixture of, hey, here I am in the right place. I've always wanted to go here, but still there was the culture shock, as you call it.
Well, you came to Washington in a great time. I guess there have always been politicians in D.C. of note. I mean, even going back to Henry Clay and before that, but you were in the Scoop Jackson, Barry Goldwater, Everett Dirksen era, in which there were some pretty funny characters in Washington.
Oh, they were delightful. In fact, the first campaign I covered for Radio Press International was Barry Goldwater's, and I covered the full fall campaign, including that night when in Arizona he watched and I watched the sad election returns for Barry Goldwater. I didn't, I wasn't sad about it, but after covering the campaign and getting to like the candidate a lot and his aides, it was, not a shock. He was destined to lose. He was running way behind in the polls to Lyndon Johnson from the start, so it was no big surprise, but it was a thrill to have covered that campaign and to have met Goldwater and all of his top officials and traveled around the country with him. It was my first introduction to travel, and we got to quite a few states, and it kind of whetted my appetite for future campaigns.
I've always thought that I would have liked to have met Goldwater. I mean, on the surface, he and I are diametrically opposed politically. But he came across as a really decent guy, and we're going to talk about Nixon, but I remember when the three politicians went to Nixon to tell him, hey, you've got to see the handwriting on the wall here, Barry Goldwater was one of them. I mean, he to me represented a kind of stalwartness in a good sense of the word in Congress.
He was, indeed. He was a man of integrity. He was a man of his word. He was very blunt. And he was one of the three Republican members of Congress who went down just before Nixon resigned and told him that for the good of the country and the good of the party, that he should get out of town and get out of the Oval Office.
One of the things I want to mention here, which is probably not the least bit interesting to the average person, is how the technology of radio news has changed. I remember, and I bought one later, but in college, to record on, and you use tape, I used a recorder called a Nagra that weighed 32 pounds and used 12D batteries. And if you wanted to send a report back, you had to clip wires onto an open telephone.
And it sounded like this.
And now you've got satellites and things where somebody can report from downtown Beirut and they sound as if they're in the next room. I mean, it is a whole new ballgame as far as electronic journalism is concerned.
Absolutely. I remember unscrewing telephones and putting the alligator clips on. In fact, at RPI, at the outset, we didn't even have an office in the White House, though I was frequently at the White House as a correspondent. And my radio broadcasting booth was about a block away in a CVS. It's now a CVS, but it was back then a People's Drugstore phone booth that I would plug myself into and broadcast back to the Bureau in that manner.
Well, you know, when I was on the road with UPI Radio, I did an awful lot of traveling. As a matter of fact, I paid for so much of it myself. That's why I'm living in poverty now. But I had a little case in my suitcase that had screwdrivers and pliers and extra wire and razor blades, and I even had 2 very, very sharp, large sewing needles in there. Because I found out if you couldn't get into a phone wire, you could do kind of what they do to your vein with an IV. You could go into the wire back there. It's a wonder I didn't get electrocuted.
I'd never heard of that. I had something that would unscrew the phone receiver so that you could, it was like a big clamp or a big vise.
Yeah, some of those were almost glued on.
Yeah, that's right. They were, that was how you unglued them. I don't think the phone company appreciated it, but that's the way you had to do it sometimes.
Don, when you were on the road, that first trip with Goldwater, I have always thought that the camaraderie between field correspondents was pretty interesting. You each had deadlines. You were each trying to grab the same story. It was kind of a friendly competition, though, wasn't it?
It was indeed. In fact, I met, during the Goldwater campaign, Peter Jennings and Ted Koppel were among those who traveled around with us, and I got to know them very well. Pike Chamberlain was covering for UPI, as I recall back then, and Pi and I became good friends and finally colleagues at UPI Audio and then eventually UPI Radio. Newspaper correspondents filed on a different schedule, but the competition was keen, but the friendship was much more important and lasted a lot longer.
Don Folsom, where were you November 22nd, 63, when you heard about the Kennedy assassination? I'm sure we all remember where we were.
I was at the RPI Bureau in Washington, and it was around noon, as you recall, and a lot of bells went off on our UPI machine, wire machine, and there was Merriman Smith's report that the president had been shot, and the next... that was a bulletin. The next report we received over the UPI wire was the highest number of bells you could have, and it said that he had been killed.
I remember that day, and I tell kids today, I remember what I was wearing that afternoon. It was a horribly dark, rainy Friday in Indiana, and I love talking to people who were in the business at the time, because everyone alive has a memory, the way young people remember when the Challenger exploded or when the Twin Towers and the Pentagon were attacked. But it was, I think, for news people in Washington, a very difficult day to get through, because no matter what your political bent was, there was a Camelot. There was a time when the rest of the world pretty much liked America, and it was John and Jackie.
That's right. It was just one of the most horrible days that I can recall, and I felt so helpless. I had wished that I had made the trip to Dallas. It was assigned to someone else. But the aftermath in Washington was also quite exciting in its own way. Before long, Johnson, the newly sworn-in President Johnson, had returned to town, and that set in motion an investigation by the Warren Commission, which I covered, and all the senators and House members lined up before TV cameras to give their condolences and their reactions and sympathy to President Kennedy on his death.
One of several visual images I remember. There was always that one of John, I almost break up talking about it, saluting his dad's coffin. But during the funeral procession, Charles de Gaulle from France, who was, 6'5" or something, was walking along with Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie, who was probably about 5 feet tall. And I remember those two guys walking side by side, and they were really representative of the diversity of the world that came to Washington for that funeral.
Most of the world leaders were here, and it was an amazing funeral procession and funeral. I happened to anchor the funeral from the Capitol Rotunda and watched as Jacqueline Kennedy kissed the coffin. And it was just a heartbreaking scene and with great sadness.
You talked about Lyndon Johnson. Was there any person thrust into the White House who had more training on how to deal with Congress than Lyndon Johnson did?
No, there wasn't. He was a master legislator, a great arm twister, great at cajoling and threatening and using the Johnson treatment, where he would get up right next to you and use his bulk. He was 6'3" and a fairly heavy-set man, and he really was a genius at getting legislation through. For example, John F. Kennedy was big on civil rights, but he couldn't get any of the legislation passed. Lyndon Johnson took over and, as a Southerner, made sure that landmark civil rights bill was indeed passed. And he was big on other issues, too, such as health care and anti-poverty. His wife was big on highway beautification. He was just, and his family were bigger than life almost when they took over the White House.
The stories are legendary about Johnson having to walk that tightrope, as you say, with being a Southern senator, yet pushing what to many was a very unpopular bill, the Civil Rights Act, which became the Civil Rights Act of '64. I remember him having a conversation with John Stennis. Stennis was a confidant of Johnson, and they pretty much went into seclusion, and I think Johnson told him, he said, John, this has got to be passed, whether you like it or not. Mm-hmm. I just wonder today, with the polarization on Capitol Hill, with the almost third-party Tea Party there, whether you could pass that Civil Rights Act today.
No, I don't think you could. And he was also on a very friendly basis with Everett Dirksen, who was the Senate Republican leader, and he cajoled Dirksen, too, into supporting this Civil Rights Act.
With the incredible voice Dirksen had, you did not want him to be your enemy.
That's right. The mellifluous voice of Everett Dirksen.
He put out a record album one time in which he spoke the lyrics to songs with the song in the background. He did the Green Beret, and one of them he did was, and I can't do the voice at all because my voice isn't low enough, but I remember hearing him go, I heard the bells on Christmas Day. And he's doing those songs. It was a genuine novelty album, but he just had the most beautiful speaking voice a lot of us had ever heard.
I know he did, and he was also a very nice guy, as were many of the lawmakers back in that day, and they all seemed to, Republican or Democrat, get along so well, which is just unheard of today.
Now, did you know Hubert Humphrey very well?
Yes, I did. I covered part of his campaign in 1968.
I remember as a high school student visiting Washington, D.C., and I'm in the Capitol building, and this was back before there was almost any security there. I mean, there had been the incident in the 50s where the Puerto Rican nationalists had fired from the gallery in the House of Representatives. Did they kill any congressmen or just wound them? Do you remember?
I don't recall. I think there were several who were wounded, and also I think the same group attacked Blair House, where President Truman was staying while the White House was being renovated, and I think that Secret Service agents either wounded or killed the perpetrators of that attack.
But even though that happened at the turn of the 50s, you could get into Capitol Hill fairly easily. You could drive up to the steps of the Capitol and take a picture if you wanted to. But I remember being in a hallway, and a big door opens, and there was some type of Senate hearing, and Humphrey walks out, and he's got a very dour expression on his face, and then the camera lights come on, and both sides of his mouth popped up into a big smile. And at the moment the camera lights came off, his frown came back, and I thought there must have been nerve endings or something in his face that every time the lights came on, he smiled.
That sounds just like Hubert. He was media savvy, and the lights going on, I think, as you put it, gave him a little extra lift, and he knew what he was doing as far as public relations and how to treat the news media in all respects.
I have talked to several people who said that he called up their radio network and said, I'm going to give you 2 cuts here. They'll each run about 15 seconds. They're about the farm bill. The last 2 words of the first one will be, I think. 3, 2, 1. And he would feed them this stuff and say, thank you, and hang up. I always thought one of the more interesting jobs in Washington would have been the very select few with the phone company who had access to the White House, because they were always changing circuits and putting in new phones. I mean, Lyndon Johnson had phones installed in the restrooms because apparently he did a lot of work in a seated position there.
He did. As a matter of fact, he would confer with aides very frequently while he was in the restroom.
That is kind of ironic, because I think the strangest bulletin ever put out on radio was when Johnson had gallbladder surgery, and apparently if you're recuperating, it's very important that you have that, well, let's just say first major trip to the bathroom. And there was a bulletin on the wire that says, President Johnson has done this, and I thought, I wish I had framed that.
Yes, he actually lifted his shirt at one point for photographers and showed them the gallbladder operation scar. He later defended that. A lot of people thought it was kind of crude, as was his
picking up the dog by the ears.
By the ears, but the dog didn't mind it, and
no, it survived.
Was used to that. But the reason he lifted his shirt and showed the scar was that there were rumors going around at the time that he had had a heart attack, and he wanted to just disprove that rumor.
I want to go back in time just for 30 or 40 seconds here and then talk about the Nixon era and the incredible book you've written. You talk about heart attacks. I mean, during the 8 years Dwight Eisenhower was in office, he was almost Mr. Heart Attack.
I know. And as his vice president, Richard Nixon, I think, acted admirably and did not try to assume presidential power while Ike was recuperating. I think that was one of his noblest acts, and I think that,
in other words, he did not pull an Alexander Haig.
Exactly. That's a good way to put it. Alexander Haig, during Reagan's, after Reagan was shot, came up from the basement to the Situation Room in the White House to the platform in the White House press briefing room and said erroneously, "I'm in charge here." And it was actually he was not next in line to be in charge of anything. It was the vice president, who was out of town, who quickly came back to town. But Haig had his line of succession a little bit wrong, in making that declaration.
Well, you know, if you look at that scene where Haig says, "I am in charge here," he's puffing on a cigarette as if he's going to be executed in about 6 minutes.
That's true, and he was also out of breath from running up the stairs. And there are some people, reliable sources, who say he may have been drinking before he made that announcement.
Let's move forward to the Nixon era. I like to think that in spite of his personal quirks, and boy, you watch documentaries and you hear Haldeman and Ehrlichman and John Dean talk about him, and he had a strange, egomaniacal personality. But as far as a chief executive, if it had not been for Watergate leading to his resignation, how do you think we would remember Nixon today?
Well, Watergate aside, I don't think he would be highly rated because of the Vietnam War. It was something that he promised to end during his 1968 campaign. There was a line that all reporters and everyone who traveled with him remember precisely. He pledged to end the war and win the peace. He never did accomplish that. In fact, the war was not ended until 1975, a year after he left office. It was on Jerry Ford's watch when communist troops finally overran Saigon. And you remember the pictures of the South Vietnamese hanging from the helicopters as they took off from the embassy in Saigon on that last fateful day of the war.
I often wondered who the person was at the top of the ladder who did not make it. The person in front of them got out of Saigon, but that one poor last person there, when the last helicopter left, what was going through his or her mind? Didn't Nixon, in one of his campaigns, more or less give the impression, not just stating that the war was going to be over, but that he had a plan and it was going to end fairly quickly, and it didn't?
That's right. In 1968, he said he had a plan that would end the war. He refused to detail just what that plan was, and Humphrey took him to task for that, saying, what kind of a person would say that they're going to end the war and not give us any details? And Nixon's answer was that he didn't give any details because he didn't want to hurt the negotiations in Paris. But he did definitely promise to end the war and win the peace, and he was not able to accomplish that. He did withdraw troops, but he stepped up the bombing, and he also started bombing a neutral, defenseless country, Cambodia, and also nearby Laos. So he widened the war and extended it rather than ending it.
Don, there was a wonderful Discovery Channel documentary narrated by the late Daniel Shore, 6 hours about Watergate. And I think before going on the air, you were telling me when you talk to college students, you play that. I thought it was a phenomenal document. And one of the things I remember was the use of the word hubris, Hubris, which means a kind of reckless display, I guess, of your power without any regard to anyone else. And that one word, I think, may have been the best word to describe Nixon.
I think it was, and I think it is still. He was just so set in his ways, and he actually was a war hawk who disguised himself in 1968 as the peace candidate. And Hubert Humphrey was so tied to Lyndon Johnson's failed Vietnam policies that a lot of voters opted for Nixon, believing that he really did have a secret plan to end the war.
Well, and the other thing, too, about that is that Nixon's defense, particularly during Watergate, was if you attack Richard Nixon, you are attacking the presidency. And he got a lot of mileage out of that.
He did. And his spokesman, instead of using the word president, often used the word presidency. just to back up Nixon's belief that, or his pose, that people were attacking the presidency rather than Richard Nixon.
You know, one of the things that you touch on that is of most interest to me in a way was the way so many of his longtime supporters were asked to fall on their own sword in protecting him near the end. I can't think of the name of the congressman from California who was his staunchest supporter and then went on television and said, I think the distinguished career of Richard Nixon should be brought to an end. And at that point, he had no friends left.
No. He didn't even have Barry Goldwater as a friend at the end. In fact, after the House committee, the Judiciary Committee, voted 3 articles of impeachment, it was pretty obvious that the Senate was going to follow suit. And Barry Goldwater counted the votes, and he had only 8 votes in the Senate. So he would have been not only impeached, but convicted and thrown out of office without any perks or golden parachute or anything else. So he took the easy way out, even though he declared many times, I'm not a quitter. He did quit.
Well, and you know, they brought out in the documentary that when the tape was discovered, that they really called the smoking gun, which proved that Nixon, supposedly the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the nation, and of course he was putting pressure on his attorney general, when Nixon started telling his people how to lie on the stand, how to commit perjury.
That's right.
The members of Congress listening to these tapes were shown a whole new side of Nixon, and they realized, look, this guy is a crook.
Absolutely. And the smoking gun tape, which you refer to, shows that only days after the Watergate burglary, that he had tried to get the CIA to tell the FBI to stop investigating Watergate because they might run into some CIA secrets, which was just a lot of baloney. But then, to the credit of the CIA head at the time, Richard Helms, he changed his mind, and the rest is history.
You bring up a friend of Nixon. His name was C.G. B.B. Rebozo. And I heard a radio announcer one time call him Bibu Rebuzu.
We used to jokingly call him Bobo Rabizi, which is a rather clownish name, but of course his name to begin with was kind of clownish.
He was a Cuban-American who was a little swarthy guy,
right,
who was very handsome, who apparently had dynamite eyes.
Oh, yes. In fact, Dan Rather commented on his sensuous eyes.
But he had a truckload of money, and the thing you say in the book, without going into too much detail here, is that, you know, they talk about politicians sleeping together. That might have been the case for B.B. and Richard Nixon.
Yes, it could well have been. They were such close friends. He made, for example, 50 separate trips to Key Biscayne over his presidency to be with B.B. Rebozo. And what they mostly did was drink a lot and frolic in the Biscayne Bay and go out on BB's houseboat. He very seldom took his wife and family with him on those trips. And BB was with the president 1 out of every 10 days. And, for example, Nixon saw his wife, for example, maybe someone, I think it was Jimmy Breslin, figured out that Nixon spent only about an hour a day with his wife.
Wow. And wasn't Rebozo either at Nixon's bedside or with him nearly at the moment he died?
He was. And he also left Nixon's library most of his money, $19 million. So they remained close for their entire lives. And it was a long and very intimate friendship. And some people, I don't there's no proof of this, thought that the relationship was so intimate that they may actually have been lovers.
Well, the thing about it, from my perspective, it isn't so much that they might have been, it's the fact that it betrayed Nixon's very, very conservative persona. I mean, it reminds me of a congressman whose name I will not mention from Maryland when I was covering politics back there, who was probably the most anti-gay right speaker on Capitol Hill, whom they caught, with a male prostitute.
That's right. I know who you mean, and I won't mention the name either.
But it's just amazing that for the sake of politics, many politicians are almost two different people. They are the people we think they are, and they are the people they actually are.
That's true, Dennis. Nixon was a homophobe of the highest order. He once said, San Francisco has become so faggy that I won't even shake hands with anybody from there.
I had not heard that. But because Nixon was the darling boy of the right, I'm immediately thinking of the guy he picked to be vice president, and that was Spiro Agnew, who we could do a whole hour on separately.
That's right.
It was a nutty White House.
Two crooks on one ticket.
One of the things that always amazes me, and people today who didn't live through Watergate don't have a sense of this, it was necessary to get the Vice President Agnew out of the White House because he himself would have been under an indictment for taking bribes in his office, and get him back to the status of private citizen and get Jerry Ford in, because if Agnew had become president, we would have gone from one person nearly under indictment to a president who was under indictment.
Exactly. And actually, Nixon and Agnew did not get along at all. In fact, Nixon wanted to drop him from the ticket in favor of John Connally in 1972. Had he Nixon, let me say it this way, Nixon greased the skids for Agnew so that he would get a more pliable vice president in Jerry Ford, who went on to, of course, pardon Nixon for all of his crimes in the White House.
Is politics so much log rolling, so much deal making, that you end up with presidents who have vice presidents who are considered dim bulbs? I'm thinking of Dan Quayle, a fellow Hoosier. But a lot of people thought, my God, let's not have the president die or we're going to have that guy in office.
That's right. In fact, Nixon once said to Henry Kissinger, not entirely jokingly, that Agnew was his insurance policy against getting assassinated.
Because nobody wanted it. But and you know the line that Nixon gave to David Frost in those landmark interviews was when they were talking about Agnew. He said, "Well, you know those Maryland politicians."
That's right.
What did you think of the debriefing, if you will, that David Frost did with Nixon? It became the subject of a movie, but it's painful to watch Nixon look at the camera and say, "I screwed up." I didn't want to see that.
Yeah. He never did, though, even in the Frost interviews, give a full-fledged apology or say, "I'm sorry." That was just beyond his ability to do.
No, all he was doing was admitting that he did not practice what he preached about politics.
That's a good way to put it. And he did, I think the major thing to come out of the Frost interviews was the fact that Nixon said, when the president does it, that means it's not illegal.
I remember that, yes.
And Nixon did very well financially from those interviews. He made $1 million. A lot of people think it was only $600,000, but James Reston Jr., who was one of Frost's researchers, took a look at the contract and saw that it was $1 million plus 20% of what Frost made on top of that.
That White House was so interesting, but there have been other interesting White Houses. If you look at the people who FDR gathered to be around him, what a bunch of interesting intellectuals and opinionated people. But in that Nixon White House, you not only had Haldeman and Ehrlichman, You had John Dean, who came out with that wonderful phrase about when a cover-up goes so far, the toothpaste is out of the tube. You can never get it back. And then you had Jeb Stuart Magruder and Tony Ulasewicz, the guy with the New Jersey Mafia voice who ran the hush money back and forth for the people who were arrested in the Watergate. I mean, it was almost, if you had written that as a plot for a movie, somebody would have said, that can never happen.
You couldn't make up stuff like that. It was just unbelievable. And Tony Ulasewicz brought a little humor to the Watergate hearings in many ways, but one of the ways that I recall was that he was making so many of these payoffs that he used so many public phones to arrange the details that he carried along with him one of those busman's coin changers that he would press the quarters out of as he made his phone calls.
Wow. Well, you know, of course, and it's brought out in the great movie All the President's Men. By the way, before I ask a question about that, what did you think of that movie? I thought Jason Robards, as the managing editor of the newspaper, was fantastic.
He was. He's still alive, and I saw him not too many months ago when the Washington...
We're talking about Ben Bradlee, right?
Ben Bradlee,
yeah.
Yes. He's now in his 90s and fairly frail, but he did show up at the Watergate 40th anniversary party that the Washington Post put on at the Watergate Hotel, by the way, and I was lucky enough to be invited to that, and first time I've ever seen Woodward and Bernstein and Bradley in person, and they put on quite a show. It was 600 or 700 people showed up, and there was a panel discussion featuring John Dean and Woodward and Bernstein. I think it was narrated, one of the narrators or moderators was Jim Lehrer, and it was just a terrific show.
Well, you know, in Washington, D.C., there was a local department store chain called Woodward and Lothrop. And I remember twice on the air when I was supposed to have read Woodward and Bernstein, I said Woodward and Lothrop.
I can see where that mistake could easily be made.
You know, when I would have company visit from the Midwest during the 20 years I lived in Washington, and I moved there in 79, everybody eventually wanted me to show them where the Watergate was. And I said, well, it's just a hotel. It's a hotel and an office complex. I don't care. I got to see it.
Yep, getting back to Woodward and Lothrop, we finally, instead of calling them Woodward and Bernstein all the time, just shortened it up to Woodstein.
That works, doesn't it?
That's right.
Don, one of the other aspects of Watergate was the nearly endless televising of both the House and the Senate committees, and so many people stood out. I remember Congressman Sandman and Representative Dornan, who was a Catholic priest and came in his priest, I'm not going to say outfit, I can't think of the proper word, came dressed as a priest to the hearings, which gave him a little bit of interesting dignity. And then there was a woman from Texas who was an American black woman who had one of the other phenomenal voices of the time, and that was Barbara Jordan.
I know. Barbara Jordan was an amazingly bright and a very articulate woman, and she was a star of the House Judiciary Committee hearings. Those hearings, both on the Senate side and the House, were very critical to the eventual resignation of Richard Nixon.
And then, of course, on the Senate side, you had Sam Ervin.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember, I guess everybody will, the fact that you may know the characters here, but somebody asked Ervin if he understood what the proceedings were all about, and he said, "Yes, sir, English is my mother tongue." Don, what is, from your standpoint, having worked in the White House when all of this was, as they say today, coming down, what is the legacy of the whole Watergate thing? Did it teach us anything?
I think it did. I think there are a lot of lessons to be gained. I think maybe the first lesson would be to tell the truth and don't cover up. and get it all out, and you're not going to be in as much trouble if you cover up. I think even Nixon said that the cover-up is always worse than the crime.
If Richard Nixon had gone on national television, which his personality would not have let him do, but if he had gone on television and say, ladies and gentlemen, yes, some dirty tricks happened, and I hate to say this, but it happens in every administration. We were wrong, and we probably won't let this happen again. He might have saved something out of that, but he was incapable of doing that. As you say, he never apologized.
No, he wasn't capable of it, and you're right. If he had come clean, or as clean as he could come, I think that he would have escaped the impeachment proceedings and the resignation and all the rest. And I think that his term in office would have been considered mainly successful, except for the war in Vietnam.
One final thing, Don Folsom, and that is a mutual friend of ours was a legend in the White House. And I worked with her. I had some wonderful moments. We would do lunch every so often. What was it like to work with Helen Thomas?
Helen Thomas was just the most wonderful person I've ever met. She was a great reporter. She did have one drawback, but she never let it get into her stories. She was very pro-Palestinian, which is understandable because she is a Lebanese, has a Lebanese background. She was from Detroit, from a Lebanese neighborhood. And then she got in trouble, as you know, a few years back for making some what many people think were anti-Semitic remarks. And but aside from that, she was a terrific a journalist and just a wonderful person. You couldn't ask for a better person to work with or to know as a friend.
Don Folsom, you have always been a good friend of mine, and you're blessed with a beautiful voice and a nearly photographic memory on a lot of things.
Please come back, and we miss you, Dennis, and it's been a pleasure being on your program.